The night was dark, the kind that swallowed the world in endless silence. The distant hum of the highway was the only sound breaking through the stillness. Keanu Reeves, tired from a long drive, was enjoying the solitude of the open road. It was a rare moment of peace, a break from cameras, scripts, and the constant noise of life in Hollywood. But then something caught his eye. A figure stood by the roadside, barely illuminated by the flickering streetlight above. It was an elderly woman, wrapped in a thin coat, clutching her purse as she stared at her car, an old, battered sedan with one of its tires completely shredded. Keanu slowed down, his instincts kicking in. Something about the scene felt off. He had helped strangers before, paid for meals, assisted people in need, but this situation felt different. As he pulled over and stepped out, the woman turned toward him, her face lined with worry and exhaustion. "Ma'am, do you need help?" Keanu asked, his voice calm and reassuring. The woman hesitated, gripping her purse tighter. There was fear in her eyes, not of him, but of something else. I think someone was following me," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder into the shadows beyond the road. A chill ran down Keanu's spine. He had expected a simple roadside assistance situation, but now it seemed like something much more sinister was at play. And then from the darkness, he heard it, a rustling sound, a slow, deliberate footstep. Someone else was out there, watching, waiting. Keanu's pulse quickened. He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but something about the way the woman clutched her purse and the way she whispered those words, "I think someone was following me," set off every alarm in his mind. His eyes darted into the darkness beyond the road. The night stretched out like an endless abyss, the trees standing motionless, their skeletal branches barely swaying in the cold wind. And then, there it was again, a sound, a footstep, slow, deliberate. Keanu didn't react immediately. Years in the film industry had taught him how to stay calm in high-pressure situations. Instead, he turned his focus back to the woman. "Let's get you out of here," he said, his voice steady. The woman hesitated, glancing back at her car. "But my things, my husband's belongings, I can't leave them." Keanu didn't know the full story yet, but he could hear the pain in her voice. Whatever was in that car mattered to her deeply, a low crunch. Another step, closer this time. Keanu made a decision. He moved smoothly, placing himself slightly in front of the woman, acting as a barrier between her and whatever, or whoever, was lurking in the shadows. His heart pounded, but his voice remained controlled. "Ma'am, do you have a phone?" She nodded shakily, fumbling in her purse. Her fingers trembled. Keanu reached into his own pocket, gripping his phone tightly. If this was a real threat, they needed backup. But just as he was about to unlock his screen, the sound of running footsteps shattered the silence. Someone was charging toward them. Fast. Keanu barely had time to react before a figure burst from the trees. A man, hooded, dressed in dark clothes. His face was obscured, but his movements were aggressive, his intent clear. The woman let out a sharp gasp, stumbling back against her car. Keanu didn't hesitate. His instincts kicked in. He shifted his stance, bracing himself as the man lunged forward. At the last second, Keanu stepped aside, using the attacker's own momentum against him. With a swift motion, he grabbed the man's arm and twisted, sending him sprawling onto the ground. The attacker groaned, but didn't stay down for long. He scrambled to his feet, clearly not expecting a fight. His head snapped up, and for the first time, Keanu saw his face under the dim light. Young, maybe late 20s. Wild eyes. A thin scar ran down the side of his jaw. And then, Keanu saw the glint of something in his hand. A knife. His grip tightened on his phone. One wrong move, and this could turn bad fast. "Hey!" Keanu said evenly, raising his hand slightly in a non-threatening way. "You don't want to do this." The man hesitated, his breathing ragged. His eyes darted to the woman, then back to Keanu. It was clear. He hadn't expected someone like Keanu Reeves to be standing here, in the middle of nowhere, protecting this woman. A tense silence stretched between them. Then, in an instant, the man made his choice. He turned and bolted into the darkness. Keanu didn't chase him. He waited, listening as the footsteps faded into the distance. Only when he was sure the man was gone did he exhale, turning back to the woman. She was gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, trying to stay strong. "Are you okay?" Keanu asked gently. She nodded, but her voice was barely a whisper. I don't know why he was after me. I don't even know him." Keanu frowned, glancing back at the road. Something wasn't adding up. If this had been a random mugging, why hadn't the guy just grabbed her purse and run? Why linger? Why attack? "Let's get you somewhere safe," Keanu said. "We'll figure this out." The woman hesitated. Then slowly she nodded. Keanu walked her over to his car, glancing back at the trees one last time. The night had swallowed the attacker whole, but Keanu had a sinking feeling. This wasn't over. Not yet. Keanu opened the passenger door and helped the woman inside. She was still trembling, but she managed to offer a weak, grateful nod. He could tell she was trying to keep herself composed, but the fear in her eyes was undeniable. Sliding into the driver's seat, Keanu started the engine and pulled back onto the road. The headlights cut through the darkness, but his mind remained on the man who had fled into the trees. Something about the whole encounter gnawed at him. A random mugging? Possible. But that guy had been watching her before he made his move. He had waited. He had hesitated. That wasn't normal behavior for a street criminal looking for an easy target. Keanu glanced over at the woman. "What's your name?" She took a shaky breath. Margaret Langley." "Okay, Margaret. Do you have any idea why someone would follow you?" She swallowed hard, looking down at her lap. "No, I don't think so." The way she said it, it didn't sound like a lie, but it didn't sound like the full truth either. Keanu didn't press her, not yet. Instead, he focused on the road ahead. "Where can I take you? Do you have family nearby?" Margaret hesitated. "My son. But I don't want to worry him." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "I think you should let him know. Someone just tried to attack you." She shook her head, clutching her purse even tighter. "Number? He's been through enough. I don't want to drag him into this." That answer didn't sit well with Keanu. If she was in danger, why keep it from her own son? But before he could ask anything else, the rear-view mirror caught his attention. Headlights, a pair of them. At first it seemed normal enough, just another car on the road. But as Keanu continued driving, something became clear. The car wasn't just following the same road. It was following them. His hands tightened on the wheel. He glanced at Margaret. She hadn't noticed yet. "Margaret," he said carefully, "does anyone know where you were tonight?" She frowned. "I don't think so. I was just driving home when the tire blew out." Keanu checked the mirror again. The car was still there. It was maintaining just enough distance to seem casual, but Keanu had been in enough high-speed chases in movies to know when someone was tailing him. He exhaled slowly. "Hold on," he murmured, then pressed his foot down on the accelerator. The engine roared as the car surged forward. Margaret gasped. "What are you doing?" Keanu kept his eyes on the road. "Testing something." The other car sped up. Margaret twisted in her seat, finally looking back. "Oh my God," she whispered. "They're following us." "Yeah," Keanu muttered. "I noticed." The highway stretched out ahead, empty at this hour. Keanu's mind raced. He could lose them, but he needed to be smart about it. If these guys were serious, they might be armed. He had to make sure Margaret stayed safe. "How good is your memory?" Keanu asked suddenly. Margaret blinked. What? Can you read the license plate of the car behind us?" She turned again, squinting. The headlights made it hard, but she tried. I think it starts with 7KX and maybe a 9? "Good enough." Keanu made a sharp right onto a side road. The tires screeched as they hit the turn, but the car behind them reacted instantly, following without hesitation. Keanu gritted his teeth. These weren't just some random punks. They were determined. And that meant one thing. Margaret was in way more trouble than she realized. Keanu scanned the area. Up ahead, the road split, one way leading toward a small town, the other stretching into a dense, wooded area. He made his choice. "Hold on tight," he warned. Margaret barely had time to react before Keanu swerved hard, taking the path into the forest. The road was narrower here, the trees towering on either side. their branches casting eerie shadows under the moonlight. The pursuing car hesitated, just for a second, but Keanu took full advantage of that moment, pushing the speed higher. The gap widened. Margaret clutched the dashboard. "Are you sure about this?" "Not even a little," Keanu admitted, "but I don't like our other options." Up ahead, the road dipped downward into a valley. If he could reach it before the other car caught up. A loud bang echoed through the night. Margaret screamed, "They're shooting at us!" Keanu swerved just in time. A bullet shattered the rear windshield, glass spraying into the back seat. Margaret ducked, her breath coming in rapid gasps. Keanu's expression hardened. Now it was personal. Sharp crack of gunfire still echoed in Keanu's ears as he gripped the steering wheel, swerving to keep control of the car. The shattered rear windshield let in the cold night air, whipping through the interior as Margaret let out a panicked gasp, shielding her head. "They're shooting at us!" she cried. "Yeah, I noticed," Keanu muttered, his mind working fast. The road twisted ahead, sloping sharply downward. Trees lined both sides, their shadows stretching long under the moonlight. The gunman's car was still behind them, but Keanu could tell they weren't used to high-speed chases on this kind of terrain. Their tires skidded slightly on the rough road, struggling to keep up. Good. That was something he could use. Keanu made a split-second decision. He yanked the wheel left, veering off the road and onto a narrow, almost hidden dirt path. The car jolted violently as it hit uneven ground, bouncing over roots and rocks. Margaret screamed, gripping the dashboard. "What are you doing?" "Buying us some time," Keanu said through clenched teeth. Behind them, the pursuing car hesitated at the turn. It was too big to follow them easily, and the driver knew it. Instead of taking the risky path, they slowed, stopping at the edge of the road. For a moment, everything went quiet. Only the sound of their own car bouncing over the rough terrain filled the air. Then, headlights. Keanu glanced at the rearview mirror. The other car had stopped, but that didn't mean they were giving up. "They're getting out," he muttered. Margaret's breath hitched. "What do you mean, getting out?" "They're coming on foot." He could see the silhouettes of men stepping out of the vehicle, their dark figures illuminated by their headlights. They weren't going to risk driving into the woods, but they were willing to hunt them down another way. Keanu exhaled sharply. "Okay, change of plans." He slammed the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, its tires digging into the damp earth. He turned to Margaret. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "We have two choices. We stay in the car and hope they don't catch up, or we get out and lose them in the woods." Margaret's face was pale, but there was determination in her eyes. I'll follow you." Keanu nodded. "Good choice." He threw open the door, stepping into the cold night. The forest was dense, thick with trees and undergrowth. If they moved fast and smart, they could disappear before the gunman caught up. Margaret climbed out, clutching her purse as if it were her lifeline. "Where do we go?" Keanu scanned the area. "This way. Stay low. Stay quiet." Without another word, they ran. The underbrush rustled beneath their feet as they moved deeper into the forest. The moon cast ghostly light through the branches, illuminating the path just enough to see. Keanu kept his senses sharp, listening for any sign of pursuit. And then, there it was. Voices, low, angry, and getting closer. "They couldn't have gone far," one of the men shouted. Keanu and Margaret pressed themselves against a thick tree trunk, breathing heavily. Margaret's hands were shaking, but she remained silent, eyes wide with fear. Keanu peered around the tree. He counted 3 figures moving through the forest, their flashlights sweeping over the ground. Too close. Margaret clutched his sleeve. "What do we do?" she mouthed. Keanu took a deep breath. "Trust me." Then in one smooth motion, he grabbed a heavy rock from the ground and hurled it as hard as he could into the distance. It crashed through the brush, snapping branches and sending leaves flying. The men froze. "There! Over there!" They turned toward the sound, their flashlights swinging wildly. Keanu didn't hesitate. He grabbed Margaret's hand and pulled her in the opposite direction. They ran. Branches slapped against their faces, roots threatened to trip them, but they didn't stop. Keanu's mind raced, searching for a plan. They couldn't keep running forever. Then, through the trees, he saw it. A cabin. Nestled in the darkness, old and abandoned, its windows boarded up. But it was shelter, a place to regroup. Keanu pointed. There! Go! Margaret didn't ask questions. She sprinted toward the door as Keanu took one last glance behind them. The gunmen were still searching the wrong area. They had a few minutes, maybe less. Reaching the cabin, Keanu tested the door. Locked. He exhaled sharply. Step back. Margaret did as he said. Keanu lifted his foot and kicked hard. The old wooden door splintered, flying open with a groan. They rushed inside. The air was thick with dust, the scent of old wood and damp earth filling the small space. Cobwebs clung to the walls and broken furniture littered the floor. It had been abandoned for years. Keanu shut the door behind them, locking it as best he could. He turned to Margaret, his breathing heavy. We're safe for now, he said. Margaret exhaled shakily, clutching her purse to her chest. Who are these people? Keanu's jaw tightened. That's what we need to find out. Outside, the forest was silent again, but they both knew the truth. The night wasn't over yet. She nodded, her breath shaky. Keanu took out his phone. One chance. He dialed fast. The line rang. Then, 911, what's your emergency? This is Keanu Reeves, he said, keeping his voice low. I need immediate police assistance. There's been an attempted murder, and we have critical evidence in an ongoing federal investigation. The dispatcher hesitated. I'm sorry, did you say you're Keanu Reeves? Keanu sighed. Yes, and I'll sign autographs later. Right now I need cops, fast. A pause, then, units are on their way. Keanu hung up and turned to Margaret. Help is coming. But she was staring past him, eyes wide with fear. Keanu turned. One of the gunmen had found them, and he was aiming right at Keanu. The gunman's hand was steady. His finger hovered over the trigger, his eyes cold and calculating. He had found them. Keanu's body tensed. He had faced dangerous situations before. On set, choreographed, controlled. But this was real. No stunt doubles, no second takes. Margaret let out a shaky breath beside him, frozen in fear. The gunman tilted his head. Hand it over, he said, voice low and firm. The notebook. Keanu didn't move. If I give it to you, do we walk away? A small smirk curled the corner of the gunman's mouth. Sure, you'll walk away. Liar. Keanu knew that look. He had seen it in films and stories, in the eyes of men who had already made up their minds. Even if he handed over the notebook, they wouldn't live to tell anyone about it. Think, Keanu, think. Sirens, faint but growing louder. The police were coming. He just needed to buy time. Okay, Keanu said, slowly reaching into his jacket. The gunman steadied his aim. Keanu's fingers brushed the edge of the journal. Then, his other hand closed around something else. Something solid, a handful of dirt. With one sharp motion, Keanu yanked the notebook out with one hand and flung dirt directly into the gunman's eyes with the other. The man cursed, stumbling back as he tried to clear his vision. Keanu didn't hesitate. He surged forward, grabbing the gunman's wrist and twisting it hard. The gun fired, a deafening bang, but the bullet went wild, striking a tree instead of flesh. Keanu followed up with a knee to the stomach, then an elbow to the back of the head. The man crumpled, unconscious. Margaret gasped, covering her mouth. Keanu grabbed the gun from the ground and checked the forest. More men were closing in, flashlights bobbing through the trees. They weren't out of danger yet. Come on, he urged, grabbing Margaret's hand. She ran beside him, stumbling but keeping up. The sirens were close now. Blue and red lights flickered through the trees. And then, headlights. A black SUV roared down a nearby dirt path, cutting them off. The driver's side door opened, and a tall man in a suit stepped out. He was older, maybe late 50s, but his posture was rigid, military-like. Keanu recognized him immediately. Gerald Knox, ex-CIA, now a private security contractor. The same name that appeared in Margaret's husband's journal. Knox smiled faintly. Mr. Reeves, I have to say, I didn't expect you to be involved in this. Keanu kept his stance firm, his grip tightening on the gun. Funny, I didn't expect to be running for my life tonight, Knox chuckled. Unfortunate timing, really. Margaret clung to Keanu's side, whispering, That's him. That's the man Richard worked for. Knox nodded. And now Richard is dead. A shame, really. He was a good man. Keanu's jaw clenched. You had him killed, didn't you? Knox exhaled almost tiredly. That's a strong accusation. But let's not dwell on the past. Here's the deal. I take the journal. You and the lady walk away. No harm, no foul, Keanu scoffed. You expect me to believe that? Knox smirked. But I expect you to be smart enough to know that you're outnumbered. The gunmen had regrouped behind him, weapons raised. Keanu counted at least 4. A standoff. The sirens were close now, just a few more seconds. Keanu took a deep breath. You want the journal? He pulled it from his jacket and held it up. Knox's eyes gleamed. Good man. Keanu nodded. Then, he threw the journal as hard as he could over Knox's head. It sailed through the air, flipping end over end, and landed directly in front of an approaching police cruiser. Knox's smirk vanished. No! Red and blue lights flooded the forest. Tires screeched as squad cars skidded to a stop. Freeze! Officers shouted, guns drawn. The gunmen hesitated. Some dropped their weapons immediately. Others twitched, unsure. Knox took a slow step back. His hands were still at his sides, but his eyes burned with fury. Keanu exhaled, finally allowing himself to breathe. Margaret nearly collapsed in relief. 2 officers rushed forward, securing the journal. Another set of officers stormed Knox's SUV, pulling out more documents. Knox raised his hands, but his expression never changed. This isn't over, he said quietly to Keanu. Keanu tilted his head. Actually, I think it is. The lead officer approached, handcuffs ready. Gerald Knox, you're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and attempted murder. Knox gave Keanu one last look before they pulled his arms behind his back and cuffed him. This won't hold. Keanu shrugged. Maybe, but it'll be fun watching you squirm. Knox chuckled darkly. You should have taken my offer. Keanu smirked. I don't do business with bad guys. The officers led him away. The gunmen who had chased them through the woods were rounded up, weapons confiscated. The flashing lights illuminated the forest, turning the nightmare into something real. Margaret let out a shaky laugh. We survived. Keanu smiled. Yeah, we did. She turned to him, eyes filled with gratitude. Keanu, But before she could finish, an officer approached. Sir, we'll need your statement. Keanu nodded. Of course. Margaret squeezed his hand. Thank you. He smiled. Anytime. As the chaos settled and the criminals were taken into custody, Keanu Reeves did what he always did. He walked away. Another adventure, another story, just another night on the road.